later. Now I'd like to welcome Adam Rouhana to the stage. Adam is a Palestinian-American artist and photographer based between Jerusalem and London. Rouhana's photography works to deconstruct Orientalism through his subjective lens within the broader context of Palestine. Through his investigations, he questions his position as a Palestinian behind the camera, both as a Westerner, having grown up in America, and as an Arab. Rouhana received his master's from the University of Oxford. Through the introduction of new narratives, his work embraces themes of the past to create a contemporary Palestinian visuality, characterized by representations of Palestinian lives that embody an active ethic of self-determination. He is often inspired by scenes of his grandmother's fruit orchard and domestic life from his early memories in Palestine. His work has appeared in the New York Times, Aperture, and Dazed.
Hi, folks. Ahlan wa sahlan. Welcome. I'd like to first start by saying thank you all for coming out on a Saturday morning and for spending your Saturday with us. I'm grateful to you all for being here. And just to check, can you all hear me clearly? Great. I'd also like to give a big thank you to Rachel Dedman and Catherine Troiano for inviting me to speak today on this panel with such incredible speakers. I'm really, truly humbled to be a part of it. To start, I have to admit that this talk is really just a sort of work in progress. It's a set of ideas that I started to develop during my residency at Dar Jasser in Bethlehem earlier this year. My main line of work is to make images. I'm a photographer. So this set of ideas runs parallel to my current body of work and, in some sense, has helped me to structure the work that I'm making. That said, I'm excited to share them with you and to engage really in a discussion to hear what you all think. So thank you for opening this space. Let's see here. So, broadly speaking, my talk today is split into 4 parts. First, I'll talk about the camera as a weapon of imperialism, or what I call the imperial gaze, what Morrison called the colonial gaze, which we heard about earlier. So there'll be some interesting overlap there. Second, we'll have a brief discussion of some of the early Palestinian photographers, what I call the native gaze. Third, I'll discuss the formation of modern representations of visuality in Palestine, which I call the settler colonial gaze. And fourth, and finally, I'll talk about how my work fits into all of this through what I call vernacularizing photography. Now, just to state for the record, although the camera is often thought of to be a European invention, the technology behind the optics of the camera was actually invented and successfully built and tested by the Muslim scientist Ibn al-Haytham in the 11th century. Al-Haytham built the first camera obscura, or the pinhole camera, and documented it in his book of optics. Now, it was not until 700 years later that Louis Daguerre produced the daguerreotype, which was announced in 1839. The daguerreotype was the first sort of publicly available and commercially viable photographic process. In the following decade, photography proliferated quickly and became a critical tool in the administrative, missionary, scientific, and commercial activities of European colonialism. The very same year that the daguerreotype was produced, the first photographers began to arrive in Palestine. At least several hundred European photographers visited Palestine during the 19th century. And these photographers were largely disinterested in the lives of Palestinians. Instead, they were searching for evidence of Christianity. They spent their time photographing sites connected to events in the Old Testament and the New Testament, and marketing their images of the Holy Land in Europe and in America. Sir Keppel Archibald Cameron Creswell and Francis Frith, whose collections are now held here at the V&A, were 2 of these early colonial photographers. Their images rarely portrayed Palestinians. Even in the images where local people do appear, they're minor characters, placed in a vast, still landscape, reinforcing the perception that biblical times were still alive and well in the Holy Land. Palestinian scholar Assam Nasr wrote that it is ironic that European photographers were able to see what had existed 2,000 years ago before on that site and ignore what was there before their very own eyes. Perhaps such blindness simply resulted from the market demand in Europe for Holy Land photographs. This, quote, amazing ability to discover the land without discovering the people, unquote, to use the words of historian Blood of Tulips, may very well have paved the way for the emergence of the popular mythical image of Palestine as a land without a people, which became the slogan of the Zionist movement half a century later. So the first question we must ask then is, for whom were these images being taken? And who had access to take these pictures? Who had access to the camera to take these pictures? And second, what is the text that these images are producing? Whose narrative are they serving, or rather, creating? As the Zimbabwean novelist Yvonne Vera put it, the camera has often been a dire instrument. In Africa, as in most parts of the dispossessed, the camera arrives as a part of the colonial paraphernalia, together with the gun and the Bible. I'm just going to pour myself a glass of water here. Thanks. But it was not long before photography was picked up locally to challenge the imperial gaze. Around 1860, a school for teaching photography was founded in the Armenian quarter of the old city of Jerusalem by a photographer named Yasai Garabedian. Over the following 2 decades, this school produced many of the first local photographers in Palestine and in the Levant. I'm going to touch on a few of these early Palestinian photographers here, but we don't have much time to discuss each of them individually. One of Garabedian's best students, Krikorian, opened the first commercial photography studio in Jerusalem in 1885. Here's a picture Krikorian took outside of the studio, which I like because it was hand-colored and has a lot of greens, and you can see the reds and yellows of the flowers. Some connection with the land here. Krikorian went on to train Khalil Rad, who opened up a rival studio in the 1890s and became the first Arab photographer in Palestine to gain renown across the country. Here are a few of his pictures. In the 1940s, Jerusalem-based photographer Keram Dejghalian, who had himself fled the Armenian genocide, relocated to Ghazi and established Ghazi's first photography studio, Photography Keram. There were a number of other interesting Palestinian photographers, but one of the main differences that I notice is that the native gaze registers Palestinians as home in their homeland. And I'd be curious to hear what you all are seeing during our Q&A. As artists and photographers, your eyes and ways of seeing and registering are important to me. But the lives we have just seen were changed forever in 1948, during the Nakba, when 750,000 Palestinians were expelled from their homeland by Zionist forces to ethnically cleanse the land for the Jewish state of Israel. Much of the work of local photographers was either destroyed, looted, or confiscated to state archives and locked away in a deliberate attempt to erase the native gaze. In its place, there was a conscientious production of a new gaze, one today that I would name the settler colonial gaze. One of the central figures in the creation of the settler colonial gaze was a man named Robert Capa, who many of you might know is widely considered to have been the greatest war photographer of our time. Capa was born in Hungary in 1913 and attended college in Berlin. But as a Jew, he was forced to flee Hitler's rise in Germany and made his way to Paris, where he continued his career. He found himself in New York City at the start of World War II and ended up embedding with the American Navy on D-Day, producing some of the most iconic images of the 20th century. After the war, Capa returned to Paris and teamed up with Henri Cartier-Bresson, one of the other greatest living photographers at the time, to found Magnum Photos in 1947. The photo agency set the standard for photography in the 20th century. Now, shortly thereafter, on May 8th, 1948, Kappa arrived at Lidde Airport, which is known today as Tel Aviv Ben Gurion Airport. Just 6 days after his arrival, Kappa shot this image of David Ben Gurion proclaiming the State of Israel, leveraging his image-making power at the height of his career to validate the State of Israel to the world. Over the course of the next 2 years, shuttling back and forth from Paris, he shot around 700 rolls of film. But according to Jorgen Genshaugen, the Palestinians only appear in a handful of images. Instead, Kappa photographed settler colonialism in action. Take a look at this image. You have a family of settlers smiling with their work tools. The caption says, quote, "Photo of settlers in the village of Tarshiha," unquote. But what it doesn't mention is that Tarshiha was home to more than 5,000 Palestinians who were ethnically cleansed from their homes at gunpoint a few weeks or perhaps months earlier. After all, who built that house in the background? Kappa is directly whitewashing colonialism for the West as Palestine was being ethnically cleansed. Here's another one. A couple romantically sit together with their feet dragging through the water in a village called Safad. What's that in the background? Oh, it's a mosque. What we see here is the attempted indigenization of the settler in the erasure of the native. Kappa's images directly enable Zionism by removing the Palestinians from Palestine through his images. As many of you probably know, Magnum became a central pillar of the modern photography industry, dominating our visual reality through its relationship with the magazine and newspaper industries. And Magnum's Zionist legacy was carried forward by a Jewish settler named Misha Bar'am. Bar'am was born in Germany and moved to Palestine in 1936. He grew up in Haifa and served in the Palmech Harel Brigade, the very same military unit that ethnically cleansed Safad, the town we saw in the previous image. According to his website, for more than 60 years, his photographs have played a central role in the construction of Israel's cultural memory, and he claims to have, quote, presented the country's image to the entire world, unquote. In 1957, Bar'am became a photojournalist for Bamahain magazine, a Hebrew language weekly published by the Israel Defense Forces. So let's take a look at what Misha was seeing. The caption here reads, quote, "After a shooting incident in the Gaza Strip, Israeli forces surrounded and detained Palestinian inhabitants in search of suspects in arms," unquote. The first thing that strikes me about this photo is the remarkable resemblance it bears to the images that we're seeing on a daily basis of the ongoing genocide today in Gaza. And in fact, this photo is from Gaza in 1969. And there's really a lot to unpack here. First, Palestinians are immediately suspects, being searched. Second, you see that the land is empty, building on the myth that the place is an empty desert, a land without a people, for a people without a land. Third, you can see that there's a clear subordination of power. The Palestinians are literally sitting beneath a single Israeli soldier in the power of the imperial machineries of the military apparatus. I think it's also interesting that the Palestinians here are many and the Israelis are few, again speaking to this sort of power asymmetry. These themes are seen throughout his work. Here you have 3 soldiers standing over and exerting control over dozens of Palestinians. We also see that the Palestinians have no faces. The theme of defacing is a major theme in his work. When you remove the face, you erase the life of those pictured, their individual characteristics, their markers, their narratives. If they don't have faces, are they even human? Defacing is a sort of precursor to their removal, to their elimination. And we also see the carceral logic in the mind of the settler. A Palestinian is someone who is in handcuffs or in jail. When juxtaposed against the modern, Western, open, topless, European, Jewish settler, the Palestinian is backwards, a Bedouin looking for clients, according to the caption. The Palestinian is black, and the settler is white. The Orientalism here could not be more clear. This one is really interesting. Misha writes in his caption, quote, Gaza Strip, Israeli soldiers making a house-to-house search to find suspects, unquote. But what he's describing is literally the background of the image, while entirely ignoring the Palestinian in the foreground, the subject of the photo. When Palestinian faces do appear in his images, they're haggard peasants and devoid of description. In 1967, Misha joined Magnum and subsequently became the regional photographer for the New York Times between 1968 and 1992. And in 1974, he became a founding member of the International Center for Photography in New York. In other words, these images and what they represent became the dominant narrative in the West. Now, of course, the material reality on the ground in Palestine was changing, and that plays some role in the differences that we see in the images. But what is in our historical memory are the traces of those images. Foucault says, the document is not the fortunate tool of a history that is primarily and fundamentally memory. History is one way in which a society recognizes and develops a mass of documentation with which it is inextricably linked. History undertook to memorize the monuments of the past, transform them into documents, and lend speech to those traces which, in themselves, are often not verbal, or which say in silence something other than what they really say. In our time, history is that which transforms documents into monuments. So what's interesting for me in looking at these images and thinking about my practice is primarily two things. First, what is the document, as Foucault calls it, that is being formed and stored in our collective consciousness? In other words, what are the cognitive visual representations that are being formed here? And second, what is photography's role in producing or deconstructing these monuments, as opposed to other disciplines like, say, science, philosophy, or literature? What we see becomes what we know. And so I'm honored to be able to share what I know with you today. These are my grandparents, Sido Naif and Siti Marta. Their son, my father, came to the US for his PhD and settled down in Boston after marrying my mom, an American from New York. I was born in Boston and grew up there, but my parents made a point of bringing my brother and I back to Palestine every year to visit our extended family. The first time I used the camera, I think I was about 12 years old. My parents had one of these old Canon PowerShot point and shoots that they didn't really know how to use, so they gave it to me and I became the family photographer. I continued to do photography throughout my 20s, but it was really just a way for me to make sense of the world. In 2022, I decided I wanted to make a concrete body of work, and where better to start than back home in Palestine. I made a rough plan of where and what I wanted to shoot, but I left the why open-ended, sort of unanswered. Instead of presupposing the answer to why I knew I had to make this work, I started with a few questions that I wanted to answer for myself. What does Palestine mean to me? And what does it mean to be Palestinian without a safe homeland to return to? How can I reconcile my experience of the unconditional love that I enjoy when I'm with my Palestinian family with what I hear about in Palestine in the media when I'm back in the US? So I moved to Bethlehem and started taking pictures. But at the outset of the project, I found myself trying to recreate these images that I had in my head. Masked protesters, a boy throwing a rock towards the Israeli soldiers, a burning olive tree, and so on. And I was able to make these images. But after a few weeks, I reflected and I asked myself, why am I trying to remake representations of a place that I myself already know so well? And what would happen if I took pictures of what I actually saw, instead of looking for something, looking to remake the visuality of the monuments of Zionist photographers? And thus, before freedom was born, instead of constantly focusing on the violence, I decided to focus on us, the Palestinians. As a photographer then, the task for me became, how can making images serve as a decolonial activity, a formation of liberatory images that challenges the intrinsic description of the monument? Vernacularizing photography for me is a sphere of refusing the subordination of knowledge power that maintains epistemic violence, that blocks decolonial thinking, pedagogy, and praxis, whether by mistranslation or silencing or discipline, in the end obscuring the truth. The creation of more authentic realities in life in Palestine can prevent documents from producing epistemic violence that stages the carcerality and subordination of the otherized in the elimination of the native. I hope to frame the livability of those remaining in their homeland, simply moving, swimming, crying, planting, loving, walking, jumping, being alive and well, despite a system designed for and intent on their removal. By naming people in their stories, my practice aims to disrupt the defacing of hegemonic epistemologies. I also have a bit of an obsession with plants and trees and greenery, and I guess it's my way of pushing back against the myth that Palestine is a desert, or that Israel somehow made the desert bloom. Because in reality, Palestine is actually incredibly green, particularly in the north. The land is giving. I think often to Jacques Rancière's concept of dissensus, where he says, the problem, first of all, is to create some breathing room, to loosen the bonds that enclose spectacles within a form of visibility, and possibility within the machine that makes the quote-unquote state of things seem evident or unquestionable. The work of dissensus is to always re-examine the boundaries between what is supposed to be normal and what is supposed to be subversive, between what is supposed to be active and therefore political and what is supposed to be passive or distant and therefore apolitical. My dad describes it vividly when writing about how negating Palestinians from their homeland means harming their relationships with it. He says, quote, not only as a political concept, but the place itself, the emotional and psychological symbolic value of belonging to the physical country. Its hills, its valleys, its coasts, its deserts, and its fields, unquote. If modern representations of Palestine have erased the Palestinians from our homeland, to vernacularize photography is to write us back home. To vernacularize photography is to engage with local knowledge, to elevate and legitimize practices from different homelands, from the personal, the collective, the quote-unquote foreign, and learn from the knowledges that they hold, thereby staging the power of narrative as our lens. So that's really it for today, folks. Thank you all for listening to me. Before I close, I want to remind us all that this is a heavy moment in our global community's history as a genocide is still ongoing in our beloved Ghazi, where the political ramifications of the camera, the gun, and the Bible are still hard at work.
Thank you, Adam. I'd like to invite the rich set of presentations that I think has raised a lot of very important, relevant, thoughtful points that it'll be great to unpack a little bit. One of the things that I noticed across your talks was that, we're familiar with this idea of photography as something that's potentially violent in terms of its power dynamics or its history as a colonial tool. This kind of the ability of photography to also feed into mythologies around ideas of proof and things that are kind of solidified in the mainstream is also something that came up. But there's another layer that you all sort of talked about, which is the structures that contain photography, whether that's a museum or an archive, whether those are the technologies that militarize them towards ideas of surveillance, or whether those are genres of photography and like photojournalism and the agencies that facilitate those genres and concretize them. I'm interested in do you think that there can be discord or tension between photography and the structures that contain them? Or is photography always a product of its containers, and therefore does it necessarily need to be aligned with what those kind of structures and containers are intended to do?
I could start just by reflecting on sort of where photography has come today versus what the power of the photograph was in the prior century. In other words, like if you think about somebody making images in 1940 or the 50s, it was an era before the internet. Film was just beginning. There was the radio. And so I think that the images that were being made at that time had an immense amount of power because they were being transmitted and published across space and time in a way that other ideas couldn't necessarily be moved. And so people saw those, and that's literally what they knew about a certain place, right? People would see those images in the newspaper. And today, I think those images were stored in these containers of institutionalization. And today, I think, I'm questioning to what extent the image holds the same amount of power. And I was thinking about the first talk about digital colonialism and thinking about we're all now making art and making photographs and reflecting on this period of the 20th century. But what's looking forward, does the image still have the same power to liberate and to kind of affect people's mind, or will it be now AI and these types of current tools that we'll be talking about in 30, 40 years looking back? So yeah, I'm not sure if that makes sense, but I guess my point is that these images, I think, maybe have a different role today than they used to, and the institutions and containers therefore also have a different role than they used to.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point, and I was actually going to kind of go to that direction in terms of answering this question, which is that, then there are new tools and new technologies that photography, kind of like they borrow that same legacy, right? Doesn't matter what the medium is, as long as it falls into a larger system that is an imperial, colonial system, white supremacist system, then that tool will be used, kind of with those power dynamic existing within it, right? There's no neutral technology, there's no neutral tool. It's all embedded and reflected in then the political, social context that it's being invented in and being used in. So all the conversations now around AI, I think, and the biases and the new developments and the data and the libraries that are like this material are being pulled from, right, is kind of, I feel like a new like overwhelming layer of how these things are going to affect visual cultures and image making, and then further wars and weapon making and kind of those things that are also like fall into a whole other, aspect of history and the lives we're living.
Is it okay if I say I agree? Because I do, and I don't really have much to add to that, other than completely agree that it's the context, but also like what you both did today and you're doing, that slightly shifting the perspective, and then it means something else. That's the countering what you said about the photographs, just reading the caption and then providing an extra explanation in your work. So I think this will inevitably have to continue, because the evil that creates that doesn't want to give up, I think.
I think there is, if we're thinking about the different roles of the structures that facilitate photography and how that shifts in a contemporary context, I mean, in some ways the history of photography reflects the history of institutions, certainly in this country. We talk in terms of preservation today, but the 19th century origins of collection building are about ownership, as you talk about. And if artists can and practitioners and thinkers and writers can subvert the original purpose of those containers or institutions, I do think there's a question of, to the extent to which we can do that successfully within an institution, even like the one that we're sitting in now. What do you think about that?
I think about that all the time, because in my practice, I'm like, all right, I made a whole film about the colonial history of Vienna and manifesting their return, manifesting their exit from this museum. And then what's going to happen? It's like how, but then when I also compare where these conversations, 10 years ago, 8 years ago, when I was, doing a lot of research and talking about cultural heritage and, these technologies of capture and ownership, you would be amazed, like the difference of audience interactions or the way people would react to these kind of conversations. And then the museums, themselves, they're like not even wanting to start to have these conversations. So when I also compare it to where we were, like, a decade ago about these kind of conversations with like museums specifically, then I do see like, a glimpse of hope that, okay, there are some stuff happening and there are some museums returning some objects that are important, objects that have been held for many, many years. So it's always that like complicated place of like, well, I still want to talk about it. I still want to make work about it. I still want to manifest these ways of seeing and being in the world. And then that extends to everything else that I do. It's like, what else do you do with this, privilege of having access to be an artist, to have this privilege of having all of you all sitting here and a stage that you can then share thoughts and discuss it. What else do you do with it other than, it's kind of what, like this idea of the artist beauty, artist duty as kind of like this thing of like reflecting to the things that are happening around us. So I think that's the minimum, bare minimum. And then from there, where things go, sometimes I'm like, the whole system needs to be destroyed just so that we can start new. And that's a whole other story. But yeah.
I'm going to agree with the second part more this time.
Let's do it.
No, I desperately want to be hopeful, but then find myself struggling. And also, I agree it's different, little bit different, but also too little. So yeah, it's this gratitude expected from the other is a bit, it needs to go. That's how I feel. It applies to photography, it applies to how we talk about it, it applies to databases, it applies to meta-narratives. It applies to new technology, I think.
Yeah. In terms of the question is how can we use institutions, or how can we leverage the power through the institutions to subvert the power?
Or is it possible to do that from within these institutions? And
right.
You could switch out the institution of the V&A for Magnum, for example.
Right,
Magnum
right.
still exists, alive and well.
Of course. Yeah, I mean, that's a question that I ask myself often as an artist. If my practice, or anybody who's practicing art in general, is, who is it that we serve, right? As Bob Dylan said, you got to serve somebody. And so, I think it's these institutions, in some sense, are structurally ingrained in a way that seems insurmountable. But on the other hand, it seems to me that the modern institutions of the 20th century are becoming sort of less relevant on a daily basis with the rise of new institutions. For example, people started to see my work when I started posting about it on Instagram. Really, so that was, I think, maybe a non-traditional way of people understanding my work, and maybe in the 20th century, folks would have discovered certain art through museums and so forth. I'm not sure if I have an answer. I think we should all think creatively about how we can, subvert these institutions or try to, reappropriate power. But it is a question that I ask myself often, whether, the work that I'm making is actually, changing people's minds at all or not.
Can I say one more thing, which is that, I think about this quote by Adrienne Mary Brown, who is a queer black feminist and scholar, an activist. And one thing she says, is that how do you do this kind of organizing and activism work, but rather than focusing it as we tend to do because of, the worlds we're living in, so much about what you're against, focusing it toward what you want to move toward, right? So, kind of like, and I think about that a lot, like what if I, instead of using the word decolonize, I would use data justice. I don't know, like, right? How do you even think about language in that way? And then with that, like how the archive that I was talking about that I made, and I made a very specific decision of I gathered this from all these Western institutions, all this material, all this research, and I want to have power. Who do I give access to, right? So kind of that's, to me, an example of how do you take something and then put it toward something else that then builds something that other people can also, again, build on. And I feel like that's something that I can always really admire with the work of, again, activists and scholars who are underground doing this kind of community building work. And it's much more focused toward that way of thinking about, these topics.
Can I ask a quick question? So the kind of the reaction to decolonizing, is it because how it's kind of it's now used in so many contexts that it stopped meaning what it was supposed to mean? Is that?
Yeah, partly also that, but also partly I feel I don't know, the kind of community and healing work that we need to do, which is in our own communities, happen when you can just remove so much of focus on the against, when you can just be together and work again toward. And I feel that's where I've felt the most power ever of doing something that matters. I'm part of this very small Iranian feminist collective that we've been working, since the Women Life Freedom. It kind of became a big core of the activities we do and the organizing and we do it and archiving. But it's also the kind of sisterhood and kinship that I've never felt that deeply since I moved out of Iran, outside, as a living in this diasporic space. So, and I think those are the moments that you really feel that's the power that you can build together and hold on to, and it's sacred, in some way. And yeah, I feel like living in this world, those are the things I personally try to cling on to stay sane.
And I think this point about terminology is interesting because decolonization and the decolonial has certainly kind of, as you say, moved away from what it was intended to mean with the kind of frequency with which it's used as a term. And I think that that's also true of the idea of access, which has come up a lot today. Access to information, access to places, to people, to knowledge, to technology. Access is very much a term that we use frequently in a museum context, but although it's often positioned as something positive, access to something is positive, it's often not, because if access is granted within an unequal system, then the access is not equal, and it can also kind of lead to control and dominance. Would you be able to reflect a little bit on this kind of idea of false promise around access? And I'm looking at you because in your talk, this idea of the access to the drone photograph directly led to violence, which I thought was a very interesting way of kind of interrupting this typical idea of access that we understand as a universally positive thing.
Before that drone footage, I wanted to say the project that you're working on, that with the English access, you have limited, and to me that, I don't speak Farsi, but to me that is just so good, because that, especially part of the world who is so used to having the access, so used to others speaking its language, suddenly encountering that kind of, oh, so I am not given access to this purposefully. I think it's a sobering encounter. I don't want to talk too long, but I remember many years ago at Venice Biennale, Santiago Sierra did this work for the Spanish pavilion. I don't know if any of you remember or seen it. But basically, it required you to have a Spanish passport to enter the pavilion. So then, being a visa national, I put up a huge fight. It's just, I want to enter. But it then became a performance almost, because inside there was nothing. There was guards with guns outside, and Europeans who were with me were upset that they couldn't enter. But that denial of access was the whole thing. It was the whole conversation. And to me, it opens up more than it can when everything is translated or when people are given access to. With the drone photograph, it's so interesting because I am almost sure that I saw the source of that photograph, that military released that drone image on a Twitter account, on Twitter. And that's how Zehra Doğan made the painting. And it's impossible for her or anyone else to take that photograph from that angle on that day with that kind of military presence. But later, the photograph disappeared, like the source, like no amount of Google search, no amount of reverse image search. There isn't no way that I can get to the source of that image. And then I started gaslighting myself. I thought, well, maybe I didn't. Maybe I just thought I did. And then I read that's how it's working. That's how the film works as well. You keep questioning yourself. Did this happen? Did I see it? Did I read this? Did I understand? So I think I kind of went beyond answering your question, and now I'm answering a different question. But yeah, the access, like the openings, we think of them as positive concepts, but when we think from a different perspective, they are sometimes reproducing the existing structures and issues and inequalities, or they have potential to.
We don't have too much time left, but I think we do have time for some questions, if there are any.
Can I suggest that we take a couple and then you answer them collectively?
Yeah.
Who had their hand up?
Hey guys, maybe this is a question to Adam, just from a photography point of view. Just an open question. So much of us are here as the children of diaspora trying to reconnect to our homelands or delve into our roots more. Do you think we're also guilty of kind of seeing the homeland from a colonial perspective, or fetishizing the culture, even if we're trying to interpret it and share it with a new audience? And also maybe just your thoughts on kind of the backlash from the natives on how the diaspora are leveraging their stories and kind of sharing it without kind of nuance or radical, messy honesty that you might get from having a lived experience there. So just any thoughts on that would be great.
Is there anyone else who has a question for our panel? Over here. Adam, why don't you answer while I run round?
Sure, thank you. What was your name? Sean, thanks. Certainly, there's a difference in perspective between folks in the diaspora and folks in their respective homelands. I think that that can be a risk. I mean, I think in the case of Palestine, it's a bit different because I'm not sure, where are you from? From South India. So, I mean, in the case of Palestine, a lot of the folks that live in diaspora aren't in diaspora by choice necessarily. And so there's been, kind of a rupture of our community since 1948, and people left, or rather were forced out of their homeland and were forced therefore to live in diaspora, whether that be in the West or in the Arab world. And I think that, at least, from folks who I've spoken to who are in diaspora, I'm not sure if I would consider myself in diaspora per se, because I've been, going to Palestine my whole life, and that speaks to this question of access I was thinking about earlier. I have access to go back to Palestine, and many Palestinians actually don't. So I think that, it depends on really your intention at the end of the day. I think if you're coming with an intention to explore questions that you have about your relationship with your homeland, and it's a good intention, then all the power to you. I think that people will think all sorts of things, but everyone has a different relationship with their own homeland, and that's between them and their home. So that's the whole point of making art, is to interpret that for yourself.
I think we've got time for the one last question over here.
Yes, my question or my point is about digital colonialism. In fact, the fact that I would say since the beginning of this century, we've had sort of digital data diarrhea, where open government is one example, where, billions of gigabytes of data were released on the internet, giving citizens allegedly access to all sorts of information, but never really sort of bearing in mind, A, that not everybody has access to a computer, that's still a fact, and also not really teaching people how to use this data. So, I can go online and try and find out in my local borough, there's all this information, but it's actually really complicated, and you need a lot of time and knowledge how to do this. So I think that's, to me, is a sort of reverse digital colonialism almost. And I don't know if anybody is looking into that at all. I think it was always heralded as this new area, very positive, and in fact, I think it's complicated and not at all positive.
Thank you. Would anyone like to respond?
I think it's actually that question even becomes more complicated when you think about access to digital data and then the digital gap that exists between, the global north and global south. And personally, when I was working on this whole other project that I didn't talk about today called Meteor Speculation ISIS, where I was reconstructing some of the artifacts that were destroyed at Mosul Museum in Iraq, and then that took a shape of both sculptures, but then inside sculptures were memory cards, and also I released all the research material, but also only one of the 3D printable files, because at a time this is 2016, just to put it in perspective, I was still kind of going back and forth between these questions of access. So there is obviously generational gap, and then there is gap between, as I said, different countries in terms of how much people have access to a computer or 3D printer to print something that, I was like releasing as a file, as this idea of like, okay, now I've 3D modeled these files, and then if you have access to a 3D printer, you can reconstruct them. But at the time, I wanted to do a little test in which I released only one of the files of 12 of the artifacts that I had worked on. And what happened was that basically a very small demographics of young, mostly men in the West, 3D printed that one object. And then that was the sign for me that I don't want to release the rest of them, because to me that was this question of like going kind of again back to who is this for, and what is, like, I don't feel like I also want to be the one making decision to like release this whole heritage of a Mosul museum in Iraq to the whole public as a way to celebrate that heritage. So I think it comes as many layers, and then what do you want to do with these kind of questions of digital data and access, and who gets to have access to it? And, with 3D scanning, like these tech companies going to, countries they're doing this kind of 3D scanning work, but then, as I said, they have ownership of the data. Whereas, in some way, it could have been like, here is the technology that your locals, your indigenous people of these lands can, if they want, they can use these technologies to then, some kind of way that is not that colonial power of like, we're going to come here and educate you and show you. Not only that, but we're going to use these things and then take the data and have ownership of it. So I think it's very complicated, and it has many forms and shapes, and a very new, again, landscape of thinking through these technologies and what does it mean to use them and to have access to them or not.
Thank you to our panel, and thank you to everyone here for making it to lunch. We have run over, so we're going to extend the lunch break. If we come back at 2:00 instead of 1:45, and this afternoon we will start with a listening session with Zara Malkani and Sima Tariq, followed by our second panel featuring Horace Sarkissian, Andrew Pop-George, and Jawa El-Kash. Thank you.